Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome to the Korg M1 tutorial series. Today we're going to have a look at everything we can do to shape the sounds that come out of the oscillators. That's going to include having a look at the variable digital filter. We have a control section where we can apply modulation, and we also have two insert effects per program. We're going to have a look at those today. Hope you enjoyed the episode. If you do, check out the Patreon and channel member links below. It's an awesome way to help support my channel. Now today we're starting with an initialized program, but I'm going to change the piano sound. If we head into the browser and I choose the single wave option, preset 91 is the saw wave. And the reason I'm picking that is because it's very harmonic rich. If you're doing tone sculpting with subtractive synthesis, as we're going to do today, it's helpful to have an oscillator tone with lots of harmonics because it's actually sculpting those harmonics that's going to change the tone. So a really simple sawtooth wave sounds like this. And it's pretty easy to see why it's called what it's called. If you have a look in the oscilloscope, that's a sawtooth wave. We're going to stick with a single oscillator for the majority of today and immediately jump over to the variable digital filter page. The filter in the M1 is a low pass filter. The original synthesizer wasn't resonant and a resonance control has been added to the emulation. We'll have a look at that in a moment, but we'll start off with the cutoff. Cutoff allows us to cut away, to attenuate frequencies above a given value. The value is arbitrary on the M1, as is pretty much the case everywhere. Our values range from 0 to 99, and we kind of have to work out empirically what those numbers mean. But if I just reduce the volume so that I can talk over the top of it and press a key, the shape in the spectrum analyzer below is showing you all of those frequencies. And when I pull the cutoff back, I'm scooping away a lot of the high frequencies. A strange idiosyncrasy about the M1 is that we're left with some very high peaks. Can you see these peaks up at like 13K plus? They're actually much quieter than they look on the spectrum analyzer. This, what seems to be a very large peak at minus 140 dB, that's exceptionally quiet, but it kind of looks dramatic in the spectrum analyzer. So here's us throwing away high frequencies and the sound gets duller and duller, and more of these artifacts come in, as you can see. In order to introduce resonance, we need to engage it. So to retain some sort of faithfulness to the original device, by default, resonance isn't enabled. I need to click this grayed out button, which is actually pretty difficult to see, but it's there. Now I've engaged resonance, I can introduce it. And what this does is introduce a spike around the cutoff point. It's going to produce like a peak of frequencies. So if I start introducing resonance, it very quickly becomes apparent what the cutoff actually is, because it's this bump here. So if I adjust the cutoff now, you can see the changing cutoff frequency, and you can also see that resonant bump that's accentuated the more I turn the control up. With a bit of resonance dialed in, we get the ability to do cutoff sweeps. It's all very well and good modifying this cutoff manually, but what we really want is the synthesizer to do that for us automatically. There are a couple of ways that we can do that, but the principal one is by introducing a filter envelope. So here we have our envelope generator intensity. This is determining how much of the envelope is going to apply to the sound. And below we have an ADSR graph. We've seen this in previous episodes. We're basically going to be able to draw a shape that will vary the cutoff frequency over time. So if I introduce some envelope intensity and then do something other than draw a flat line, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start out with an attack level instantaneously higher than the cutoff. Pull this back a bit. And then I'm going to select my decay time by clicking on this little grayed decay symbol. And then we can see the decay time here. 49 is actually fine. Let's hear what that sounds like. We're going to get a little filter sweep every time we press a key. Great. Bring that in a little bit, make it a bit faster. Excellent. So that's the idea of dynamically modulating the filter over time using an envelope. But that envelope doesn't need to be static. The controls below the envelope graph allow us to modify it in various different ways. So let's deal with velocity sensitivity first. Let's introduce some velocity sensitivity, and I'm going to pull back the default amount. So now if I press a very quiet key, and then I'll press that key harder, you hear that extra spike that we're getting in the filter. And if I play the key quietly, we don't get it. Then we can change how quick the envelope operates. So if we introduce a positive value in our envelope generator time, and then choose which aspects of the envelope we're going to manipulate over time, we've only really got an active decay time here. So let's engage decay. So we press a quiet key. And now we're dealing with the time of that decay. Hit the key harder, much faster. Let's bring them back out of the equation because things are getting a bit complicated at this point. And now we'll have a look at keyboard tracking. The M1's a bit unusual in terms of filter keyboard tracking because typically if you have a cutoff at 1 kHz, regardless of what key you press on the keyboard, you see a frequency bump at 1 kHz. But if you introduce resonance, that's the best way to find where your cutoff value is. I'm going to play C3. I'm going to turn this envelope off so we can see what's going on. Here's my filter bump at about 800 Hz. I'm going to play a key 1 octave higher. And now my filter bump has just gone up the frequency spectrum. In other words, this filter is inherently tracking the keyboard. So every key that I press is applying an additional positive modulation to the filter cutoff. It's making it go further and further up the keyboard. This is a perfectly reasonable thing to do by default because very often you do want your filter to track with the keyboard, but it's unusual to not have the option to have it flat. And in fact, you can't really specify that you want to keep the cutoff frequency at an exact value. The best that you can do, and I've just kind of worked this out roughly because this kind of stuff keeps me awake at night, is if you set a cutoff value of about -40 on the keyboard tracking section, it effectively makes a more or less flat key follow range. So now if I dial a cutoff value that's reasonably positive, I'm aiming for about 1 kHz, that's close enough. Every key that I press on the keyboard has a spike there or thereabouts 1 kHz. So that's the way to generate a flat key follow filter range if you want that. But by default, control click, it's actually sloped. If we introduce a positive modulation, it makes that slope even more intense. And I won't demonstrate this last feature because it's really just a variation on a theme, but this is applying a time variance depending on the frequency of the key that we play. So we can make low keys have slower envelopes than high keys by setting our time polarity. Now let's move on to the VDF modulation generator, the variable digital filter modulation generator. Don't you love it? Let's enable that. So we start off by default with a triangular waveform. We're going to need to introduce both intensity and frequency in order to hear this. And just to make sure absolutely nothing else is getting in the way, I'm just going to flatten my envelope as well. Now I'll play a key. So that's a triangular modulator, the waveform cycling at this frequency, varying the filter cutoff by this level of intensity. So if we make it very gentle and more intense. Now it stands to reason that the shape of the waveform is going to have an absolutely dramatic effect on the filter here. One effect that I really like to play with filters is a random modulation of the cutoff. You really want to try to get the intensity working hand in hand with the cutoff so that every modulation is doing something interesting. If you push both of them too far, then lots of the modulations are going to be maxing out the filter cutoff. So you'll end up with lots of iterations of this random frequency modulation that all basically sound the same. So you want it working, you want it doing something all the time. That's pretty good. If we get back to something a little bit more gentle, let's have a sine wave next, and bring the intensity down, introduce some delay. We can start off with a non-modulating tone, and then over a period of time you hear it gradually, the filter gradually gets introduced with a delay value. And we can also sync the filter to the host tempo, and that's pretty straightforward stuff. Alright, I'm just going to disable this modulation generator for the moment. We will come back to it though, and head over to the control tab. The control tab is one of the few ways with which we can interact with this program from the outside world. The M1 isn't very well automation enabled. There aren't that many connections into it, and this screen is one of the few means by which we can change the sound over time from outside, in this case, I'm going to use my keyboard today. The 6 controls on the left-hand side are all aftertouch, and this should be pretty straightforward. Most synthesizers have aftertouch features, but just a very quick demo. I'll introduce some pitch and filter variants, and then I'll hold a key down and then press into the aftertouch. So you can hear both the pitch and the filter sweep happening there. That's all very straightforward. These controls on the right-hand side, though, take some figuring out. Well, pitch bend doesn't. We know what pitch bend does. The controls underneath, though, nowhere in the manual does it say how to actually use these controls. It's not even completely obvious what they do. Let's start with pitch modulation generator intensity. In order to hear this effect, we're going to need some pitch modulation. Well, we actually get to that from the oscillator screen. Here's our pitch modulation generator. So if we enable it, and introduce, I'll introduce a really obvious amount, okay, that's an awful lot. Now I'm going to turn the intensity back down again, so there's no pitch modulation. Head back over to my controls section. This is effectively a second performance layer that we can add on. So if I increase this intensity instead, at the moment, there's no modulation generation. Every time I press a key, you're not hearing it. Now I'm going to increase the modulation wheel. You can actually see this in the lower left-hand panel. I'm physically moving my modulation wheel. The modulation wheel is mapped into these pitch MG controls. More specifically, continuous controller number 1 is mapped into these controls, and by default, that's usually your modulation wheel. Okay, that's all pretty straightforward stuff. We can now dynamically vary our pitch modulation over time. What about the filter modulation generator? So I'm going to re-enable it, but this time turn my intensity down to 0. So we do have the filter enabled, just not doing anything because its intensity is at 0. What's the automation control that's going to enable me to access this value, because at the moment we're not hearing it? Well, it turns out that the answer is CC2. So there's nothing by default on my keyboard that's actually mapped into CC2. I've configured a couple of controls on my keyboard to do the job for me. So now I'm going to press a key, and then I'm going to move the physical knob on my Native Instruments keyboard that's going to output CC2 messages. And there they are. So that's me turning the control down. Now I'm turning it up. And that gets more and more intense. There's no visual representation going on here. There's no change to the interface. We can't see what's going on. The only way that I thought I could possibly kind of demonstrate to you is to engage write automation on the track itself. And then you can see automation being written in the interface behind the scenes. And now I'm just holding a key on the keyboard. And there's that automation being played back. So that's CC2. That's mapped into the VDF modulation generator. We also have the ability to automate our amplifier. So this is effectively tremolo, if you want to think about it in those terms. Let's enable the VDA modulation generator, give myself some frequency. And this time, I kid you not, the value is CC92. So we need to map into CC92 values. And here's me turning the controller clockwise. That's introducing that tremolo. and then I'll turn it anti-clockwise and turn it back down again. So no visible evidence on the keyboard or in the manual how to map those values, but it's CCs 1, 2 and 92. All of those demos there were just concerned with intensity, but obviously we have a frequency modulation as well. So now as I turn that knob clockwise, I'm doing two different things. I'm increasing the intensity, but I'm also speeding it up. So this is colossally clunky, but it does work. As long as you understand what it's doing, it's possible to make it work for you. One final thing I'll just mention about these CC values before we head away. If you jump over to the global page, there's an option down here to convert CC into automation. The reason you saw this automation lane appear up here is because I'm having continuous controller data map into automation behind the scenes. This is actually enabled by default. This is its standard method of operation. If you just want to work purely in MIDI CC values and record your MIDI data into MIDI parts, then make sure you disable that feature. Finally, a quick look at the insert effects. I don't propose to run through all of the effects you can see. There are many of them to play with. Just a very general introduction. Each program has two insert effects. So if we apply some phaser, there's the phaser, you can actually hear it stereo phasing. The routing for insert effects is actually relatively straightforward. Both oscillators go through both effects by this routing mechanism. If I introduce a second oscillator, let's just bring one in, and I'll leave it on piano, no reason not to. We are getting both sounds in both ears. So this stereo signal, these two signals that are coming out of FX1 are being basically crossed over and sent to the opposite side in order that they can both go into FX2 as well. So the signal is being basically dual mixed. It's probably very rare you need to worry about any of this stuff, but I'm just mentioning it in case it matters to you. Let's have a second effect as well. There's our hall, so now phase and hall simultaneously. And that'll do us for today. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Please hit like if you did. I'll see you next time. Thanks very much.